A refund policy is the only document in your business that has to pass two completely separate tests written by two completely separate audiences. The first audience is a bank dispute analyst who will read your clause for 90 seconds while deciding whether to reverse a payment. The second audience is the ICF, reading the same clause against Standard 1.1 and Standard 1.2 of the Code of Ethics. Most coaches write for one audience and the other audience flunks them. The clause is the same clause. The work in this unit is writing it so both readings pass. Liability protection and ethics compliance are not two documents. They are two tests applied to one paragraph. The liability test asks whether the clause is specific enough that a stranger with no context can apply it to a dispute. The ethics test asks whether the client knew the financial arrangement before coaching began and whether the termination provisions actually exist in writing. A clause that passes one and flunks the other is the most common shape I see, usually thorough on dollar mechanics, vague on disclosure timing, or vice versa. Standard 1.1 is the sentence that converts a refund policy from optional paperwork into a required artifact. Financial arrangements must be communicated before coaching begins. The verb is communicated, not buried in a contract appendix, not mentioned in a discovery call, not assumed. Communicated in writing before the engagement starts. If a client paid you and you have not handed them the refund terms, you are out of compliance whether or not a dispute ever lands. The disclosure is the obligation. The dollars are downstream. Standard 1.2 layers in the second half of the test. Termination is subject to the provisions of the agreement. Read that backward. Subject to the provisions, meaning provisions must exist. If the agreement is silent on termination terms, there is nothing for the termination to be subject to, and both sides are unprotected. A coach who terminates with no written terms is exposed. A client who terminates with no written terms has no clean exit. The provisions are not a courtesy. They are the structure both parties are entitled to. Two competencies sit underneath the ethics standards, and they are the credentialing test, not just the code test. Competency 1, subcompetency 4, asks whether you abide by the ICF code. Competency 3, subcompetency 3, asks whether you establish and maintain agreements covering fees, scheduling, duration, and termination. A refund clause sits squarely inside both. The MCC application asks you to demonstrate this, not assert it, meaning the documentation has to exist in your engagement files, not just in your beliefs about how you work. 6 elements are non-negotiable in the clause, and the word for each one is specific, not approximate. Eligibility window stated as a number, 7 days, 10 days before the third session, not the phrase a reasonable time. Pro rata or all or nothing structure named explicitly, with the conditions that trigger each. Refundable items and non-refundable items listed line by line. Request process with a real channel and a real address. Exclusions named, including completed sessions, materials, and third-party platform fees. And the satisfaction guarantee posture, which I will treat separately because it is its own trap. A satisfaction guarantee is marketing copy with legal teeth, and most coaches do not read what they have signed up for. Payment processors treat the phrase as pre-authorized chargeback consent under the services not as described code, meaning a client who is dissatisfied for any subjective reason has a clean dispute path you advertise yourself into. At small volume, the cost is hidden. At scale, it changes the posture of every single engagement, and the fee absorption from refund processing piles onto the lost revenue. Run one only if the marketing benefit dominates the dispute exposure at your actual volume. Dana is the composite that shows what discretion language actually buys you, which is nothing. 4-month engagement, $4,000 paid up front, refund clause reading refunds at the coach's discretion. The client disengages at month 3 and files a chargeback. The bank analyst asks Dana to define her discretion criteria. What does discretion mean operationally? What conditions trigger which outcome? She cannot, because the clause never defined them. The chargeback succeeds. $1,000 goes back. The clause failed standard 1.1 because there was no real arrangement, failed standard 1.2 because there were no provisions to be subject to, and failed CC3 because there was no agreement on fees and termination. Here is the same engagement with a clause that actually does the work, and the outcome flips. Sessions completed through the termination date are non-refundable. Unused sessions receive a pro rata credit. Requests must be submitted in writing within 10 days of the final session. 3 sentences. Specific window, named structure, named process. That clause is a contract exhibit the bank analyst can read in 20 seconds. It satisfies standard 1.1 because the arrangement is named. It satisfies standard 1.2 because the provisions exist. It satisfies CC3 because fees and termination are on paper. The work to do before the next video is concrete, and it has to happen on your actual current policy, not in the abstract. Open the refund clause in your engagement agreement. Read each sentence through both tests in sequence. First test: could a stranger with no context apply this to a dispute, or does it require my interpretation? Second test: does this communicate the financial arrangement clearly enough to satisfy standard 1.1? Was it on paper before the client paid? Any sentence that fails either test is the next sentence to rewrite today, before you collect another payment.